So, one thing that's really clear is data is not useful in itself. Data is useful because it's a tool for communication, right? To have common understanding, right? And to work on potential solutions, right? So you use data to keep your conversations focused on what's happening and not making things up, right? Or not pointing fingers, say, this is your fault, this is your fault. No, this is what we see in the data. This is something that has to change. So let's figure out solutions for how this is going to change, right? And then let's show why this matters as we're working on these solutions. Let's use the data to show why we're doing this change, right? Improvement takes change. So you've got to get people changing what they're doing. You got to have a good rationale, right? So you use the data to show why this change is going to make the difference. Data is a communication tool.
Welcome to Corwin's Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast with hosts Peter DeWitt and Michael Nelson. This podcast is from education leaders for education leaders. Every week, Peter, Mike, and our guests get together to share ideas, put research into practice, and ensure that every student is learning not by chance, but by design.
Elaine Allensworth, welcome to the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, really looking forward to talking to you about this whole idea of using data in schools. So I'm going to just start off with a really big question. Why do we make it so complicated to use data in schools?
I don't think anyone intends it to be complicated, but people keep getting different ideas for different metrics and putting them out there without really testing them and thinking about how they might be used. And then they get used for more and more purposes. And so we end up with so much data that is just not very useful. It may not be useful in terms of the kind of data it is for the purpose that it's being used for, or it just may not be presented very clearly. It may not be clear how it should be used. So there's just I think so many reasons why, the data, even though there's so much data, it ends up not being as useful as it should be. And then, I think a lot of times too, there's data that seems like, it's useful, but it really isn't when you start digging into it, right?
Boy, there's so many directions I could go on just that, but I'm going to let Peter use that last line. I'm going to use the one of, you've been studying data and diving into this for, more than a couple decades. And what Peter and I have found is the comfortability of people around data, educators, both teachers and leaders. The comfortability around it is not there. Have you noticed that? And what do you do to have educators become more comfortable using data?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it is important to have metrics that are really transparent and that people can see in their day-to-day lives in schools, so they can see how their work impacts the metric. There are a lot of metrics that are out there that are very confusing in terms of how they're created, and it's very hard to have impact on them or to know exactly what you're doing, be able to tie what you're doing to that specific metric. So I think having those really simple, clear metrics that also are really really are going to be helpful for students, really indicate what's happening with students, something about their experience, something about their learning or their likely outcome. So focusing on those metrics is what's really going to make it easier to have conversations around the data and then figure out your strategies for improving your school, improving your instruction. I think we spend a lot of time with metrics that actually are not very useful for giving feedback or for giving direction. And so it just ends up being very frustrating. But if you have the right metrics, with the right properties, I talk a lot about properties of metrics in this book. it makes it just much easier to organize yourself around that data, right? And I think also having, good structures in place for using the data is really important too.
So the book that you just mentioned is right now, the working title is Using Data to Improve Schools, a fresh look at what matters most. So let's dive into that a little bit. You were talking about metrics. I feel like sometimes even those words can lose people. And Michael and I
Yeah.
are always focusing on developing a shared understanding, because we think a lot of people use the same words, but they have a very different idea of what that means. So if it's a fresh look at what matters most and you're talking about metrics, what does that mean?
Yeah. So you can think about different sources of data, right? So you can think about standardized test scores, course grades, attendance, surveys of students, surveys of staff, all these different sources of data. But then you take those different sources of data and you have to put them into some kind of, meaningful unit, whether that's a test score or a, meeting proficiency or a grade point average or a, attendance rate, or are you chronically absent? And so those metrics are things that are supposed to be measuring something, telling you something about the student or something about the school or something about the classroom, right? So, how often the student is coming to school, or if the student is really missing, more school than, then would help them stay on track. So you could think about attendance rate is about how often they're coming to school. That's one metric. Is the student chronically absent? That's another metric that tells you something that's a little bit different.
Would love to know if you have examples of schools or districts where you feel like, boy, this is an example that I would want other leaders to know and hear about.
Yeah.
Would love to hear that.
Yeah, well, I'm in Chicago.
Yeah.
And so I work a lot with the Chicago Public Schools. And that's why, my experience working here, I've seen data in action. And that's why I believe so thoroughly that data have to be a big part of school improvement. So, we saw high school when I first started working with Chicago Public Schools, graduation rates were, around 53%. That meant like half of students were not graduating. Um, and at that time, people said, oh, there's nothing we can do, high school graduation, it's affected by so many things outside of school and students, education, all the way back to early childhood. So there's not much you can do. But, through, kind of going back and forth between research and practice, we realized a few key things. One is that the ninth grade is really a critical year. A second thing was that what's really important is that students pass their classes in their ninth grade. So people thought, oh, students don't have the skills they need to do well when they get to high school. And we actually found, oh no, plenty of students with high test scores were failing classes when they got to high school. It was course failure that's really critical, keeping students from failing classes in that first year of high school, which I can talk about. And so they started focusing on this metric. It's a really simple metric, of, students haven't failed more than one semester of a core course in their freshman year, and the district developed early warning indicator systems around ninth grade course failures and attendance. And then through working on that metric, like really focusing on those metrics, avoiding course failure, improving attendance, and developing systems to use those data. And it's really nice, you could use, real-time data to, have working groups around the data. They improved the graduation rates. They're in the high 80% right now in Chicago. And at the same time, the graduation rates improved. So we have way more students graduating high school. Test scores improved. So students, more students are graduating with higher test scores, taking more rigorous courses. And that also led to more students going to college, or with college enrollment rates actually increased because students were better prepared. And, our college graduate Graduation rates also continue to improve. So we have just way more students graduating college from Chicago Public Schools, thousands and thousands more students graduating with college degrees every year than we did, back, a decade or two ago, the improvement was just incredible. And it really was all about organizing around the right kind of data. Right. So I've seen that it's possible. I've seen dramatic improvement is possible, but it does take focusing on the right data and organizing yourself to use those data for continuous improvement.
One of the things you've talked about in the past is just the whole idea of data overload, and you had actually mentioned that earlier when we were just talking. Many leaders actually struggle with having too much data, but not knowing how to use it effectively. So what advice do you have for school and district leaders on prioritizing and interpreting data in a way that leads to actionable decisions like you've done over the past 10 years in Chicago?
Yeah. Well, I think you really do have to interrogate the metrics that you're using, the data that you're using, to make sure that it has these properties that are really going to be useful. So things like malleability. How can you actually change it, and how much can you change it? I think we spend a lot of time focusing on metrics that we just do not currently have the technology to know how to change very much. Does it really matter for the outcomes you ultimately care about? So think about the predictiveness. So, why do we care about grades and test scores, right? Do we want students to just have high test scores and high grades? No. We care about grades and test scores because we think they represent student learning. We think they represent readiness for college, readiness for career, right? So the metrics that we use around those data, we want to make sure they really are predictive of how students will do in college and career, right? And so think about, do we want this metric for the sake of the metric, or do we want it for something else? And then does it really tell us something about how students are going to do later? And beyond that, we'd really like it to be causal, meaning that if you improve that indicator, you will improve students' outcomes later. And then beyond that, if you want continued, so that's what you'd really want to think about if you're looking for data for goals, for example. If you're looking for continuous improvement, then you want to also think about availability, like real-time availability. Is it something you're only going to get information on once a year? It's going to be really slow in terms of your cycles of improvement, right? You're going to want something that you can, turn around pretty quick, right? And then you've got to think about communication too. How are you communicating this metric to people? So, one thing that's really clear is data is not useful in itself. Data is useful because it's a tool for communication, right? To have common understanding, right? And to work on potential solutions, right? So you use data to keep your conversations focused on what's happening and not making things up, right? Or not pointing fingers, say, this is your fault, this is your fault. No, this is what we see in the data. This is something that has to change. So let's figure out solutions for how this is going to change, right? And then let's show why this matters as we're working on these solutions. Let's use the data to show why we're doing this change, right? Improvement takes change. So you got to get people changing what they're doing. You got to have a good rationale, right? So you use the data to show why this change is going to make the difference. Data is a communication tool.
I love that it's a communication tool, and love everything that you just said around it. As a former superintendent, my mind is kind of going all over the place. And if I continue to go back to your example, because I think it's an example we could use throughout the podcast of, you tracked ninth grade credits, is what, in traditional high schools across the United States, you have to have a certain number of credits to get your high school diploma. You want kids to be in more rigorous programs. You want kids to move on to be career ready or take their next step after high school, whether that be college or, a tech program or whatever. You want them to be ready with that diploma to be able to launch them. I've seen districts kind of say, okay, well, we're going to simply change the school policy, because by changing the school policy where we open up classes, let's say, to more students up to classes. That alone, that piece of that might not change the data. What I heard you say is the core piece of the data really went back to that ninth grade um, credits. And from that ninth grade credits, we were able to change the data in these multiple areas because of that. The kids were able to get into more rigorous programs. The graduation rates did come up. More college acceptances occurred. And I'm assuming at the same time, board of directors are changing policies to make all of that happen. But the core of it was this ninth grade, the tracking of the data of the ninth grade credits caused the ripple into the other areas. And I think we as superintendents sometimes make a misstep that we're gathering data that's not and do something that's not the core root of what we
That's
want.
right.
Is that making sense, or did I explain it poorly back to you?
No, it's exactly right. It definitely is a ripple effect if you are focusing on the right thing, right? So the reason that, that mattered so much is it turns out that, first of all, ninth grade is this really critical year because
Right.
that's the year when students are setting their patterns that are going to set them up for the rest of high school. And they're also figuring out, do I belong here? Can I do this? All those mindsets that are really powerful for, whether students are going to persist when work gets hard. So, if they have that success in their ninth grade year, they've figured out how to do high school. They know they can do it. They feel like I belong here, right? All those really positive things. If they fail, then they haven't figured it out and they're always going to be wondering, am I just going to fail again, right? And so that's going to undermine them in the future. So that focus on the ninth grade year and the focus on passing your classes then leads students to put in more effort for the rest of their high school career, right? And that putting in more effort then leads them to, get higher grades, have higher test score gains, take more rigorous coursework, and have, more success. But then the focus becomes how do we get students to pass their classes in ninth grade, right? And so attendance is a big part of that, making sure students are coming to school and, dealing with whatever barriers they might have from coming to school, figuring out, why they're not coming to school. And I could get into why that is because we did do research on that. But then also really thinking about how courses are set up to support students to be successful in different ways. And so then that leads to thinking about, well, what's happening with instruction, right? Like what's happening in terms of the support students are getting and the quality of instruction. It also led, as teachers were working on improving pass rates, them to realize, oh, I better keep up with my grading and get things, and that itself helps students to be more likely to pass their classes, right? So as you're working with the data, you realize, oh, this is actually important for me to do because, students, a lot of times students didn't even know they were failing because teachers were not keeping up with their grades. I mean, but, things like that, right? So this kind of ripple effect, right? If you can get focused on the right kinds of data. And again, it's those metrics that are just really tied to practice, really clear, easy to understand, that matter a lot for those long-term outcomes. Because when we look at things like predictiveness and we look at pass rates in ninth grade or students' grades in ninth grade and things like, I mean, almost any outcome you could think of, high school graduation, college readiness, test score gains, whatever, you can think of, super predictive and predictive in a causal way too, which is, again, important.
Part of what you were talking about is the idea of the right kinds of data. And that's always been kind of a struggle too, I think, for schools. Tom Guskey, great researcher who talks about assessment, said that in order to raise somebody's self-efficacy when it comes to whatever, using strategies in the classroom, having an impact on student learning, there are really three things that need to be in place. And number one is going to be a protocol. So that data team meeting is going to be really important. Your PLC, your faculty meeting is an important space if you use it wisely. Number two is that you need to use evidence teachers trust, because he said that if teachers don't trust it, they're not going to use it. And the third is that the strategy needs to make a difference within weeks and not months. But back to that second part, the evidence that teachers trust, Tom also did a really interesting study where he gave leaders a set of metrics and he gave teachers a set of metrics. And then they started anywhere from standardized testing to teacher-made tests. And he asked them to rank what they thought was the most effective. And teachers actually ranked it from number one would be a teacher-made test to a standardized test being number 10, like a state test.
Mhm.
Administrators, it was completely inversed. Administrators, standardized test number one, teacher-made test number 10. How do you actually, all of this information is really great. What we notice though is that sometimes people don't have confidence over the data that's being used because of personally how they feel about it. And if we know that from a study from like Tom that talks about the fact that it's got to be evidence that teachers trust, how would leaders go about doing that? Not just banging anybody over the head with a standardized test, but being able to allow in that idea of the teacher made piece as well. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, conversations are really important here, and evidence is really important. And really interrogating the metrics that people believe in so strongly. Um, I I could go into the evidence. I don't know that you want me to do that because as I'm thinking that, you know, a lot of people have a lot of assumptions about metrics that really just don't hold up if you start interrogating them. Like a lot of the metrics that are made from standardized tests, they don't hold up. So, you know, when the teachers are saying, hey, I don't trust these metrics, well, what are they exactly? And what don't you trust them for, even more importantly? Because I do think, for example, because they're so ubiquitous, you know, they're everywhere, standardized tests get used for everything, but they're actually, you know, designed for specific purposes, and then they get used in lots of ways that actually don't make sense. And so then that leads people to not trust them, right? Because they're not useful for some purposes, right? And so I think you do need to think about, you know, is it useful for the purpose I want to use it for? And not make assumptions. You know, that yes, it's made by, you know, it's made by experts, so it must be telling us what we think it's telling us.
Well, Elaine, we would like to thank you for being on our Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast. The book, so far, you're going to have it done. We know you're going to have it. It's going to be published soon. Is Using Data to Improve Schools. That's a working title. A fresh look at what matters most. And we just really want to thank you for being on the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
What I like about this is that Elaine actually said data is a tool for communication. I think that is really well said.
Absolutely. And her, you know, her example of ninth grade credits as like this core piece of data. Know your data, know why you're collecting your data, and know what it means for other parts of your system as a former superintendent. I think that was spot on because if you don't choose ninth grade credits and you simply say, our piece of data that we're tracking and following is high school graduation rates. Okay, how are you going to get there? So what is the core to that end? And, you know, in our system, we found the same thing. If a student failed more than one class, they were, you know, 80% more likely to drop out before they reached high school graduation. If they had one or less fails in ninth grade, for us, we knew we had them on track, and we could track them that way. So we put in systems to support those students that may have failed two or more as they move forward, and that kind of caught them up. And I think what she was saying is the meaning, let's get to that core. Let's figure out what that core piece of data, the purpose of it, and that will ripple out to other parts of your system. Ninth grade core credits, that's one of those core data pieces.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I do appreciate about her is that, I mean, she's definitely the other end of the spectrum thinking for me as far as with her thinking. I appreciate the fact that even when she's hit with the graduation rate story that she told us about Chicago, she talked about that, she looked at the percentage. She said 53% of students were graduating. And from the data standpoint, her response was, we need to look at the data to understand where we're going wrong. So even though people were saying that's just the way it is, or kids aren't going to graduate from high school, or high school is harder, it was almost like some of them were accepting that 47% of their kids weren't graduating. So even with her mindset, it was, no, we need to look at the data to understand why this is happening. And I think that's an important thing for me to kind of think about, is when you are confronted with people who don't have a belief, data can be in a really important place. It actually reminds me of what you always talk about in our workshops, have that third thing in the room where you can look at the data to say, no, we have to understand what our issue is, because this is not acceptable. And we can use data to figure out how to move on. And now she's talking about how they're in the high 80 percentages. So I think that just speaks to the fact that getting the emotional side of education is really important. Teaching is so personal, right? But the data side is also really important to help us understand where we have errors and where we need to be able to correct that. And I think that was the basis for what she was saying as well. So I appreciated the conversation.
I did too. And I think, it's just really well done. So I'm going to look forward to her book and wish her well for sure.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening to the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast. We're always looking for feedback. If you're watching us on YouTube, give it a like. If you're listening to it on your favorite station, give us a like if you can. But once again, always contact us with your feedback too. And we love that people are sending us ideas for guests as well. So Michael, always good to see you.
Always good to see you. Until next time.
All right. See you soon. Thank you, everyone.